This is awesome. So my name is Becca. I am the Director of Sports Medicine for Spooner, and today we're going to talk about the high school athlete, which you all know. And if you've been around for 3 years, you might have noticed we changed the name of these seminars. So we used to call them the Athletic Training Seminar. There was a lot of reasons for that, but as an athletic trainer myself, new in the role, new to the area, I wanted to connect with athletic trainers, get to know that community better. We wanted to do that as a whole company, and so that's how these started. The amazing thing is now we've had to change that to the Sports Med Professional Seminars, and the reason is this is our largest one to date with over 200 people signed up, and we have such a variety of professions: strength coaches, PTs, ATs, physicians, nutritionists, psychologists, and that excites me to no end because that really speaks to what the mission of Spooner Sports Medicine is, to collaborate, especially interprofessionally, because as we all know, we do not take care of our athletes at the highest level if we're not all working together on that sports medicine team. So very excited to have the name change. So welcome to the first Sports Medicine Professional Seminar. Since we are talking about the high school athlete today, I do want to just do some quick promo for 3 off-season camps that we're running within Spooner. So we have at our Sports Institute location, we have the female high school athlete program, we have a high school college program, and then at our North Phoenix location, we also have a female athlete program that we're running. So if you would like more information about that, you can either go to our website, spoonerpt.com, and click on the performance link, or go ahead and follow us on Instagram at Spooner Sports, and you'll also find information there about those programs. So, how is today going to go? For those of you who have been with us, you kind of know we do 30 minutes for each speaker. We have 2 great speakers today. They'll both talk for around 30 minutes, and then at the end we'll do Q&A. For those of you who are in person, please feel free to ask questions. I have some questions that got sent in before, but I would love for you all to answer questions or ask questions first, and we'll have our speakers answer those for you. So, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Randon Hall. He is a board-certified, fellowship-trained pediatric sports medicine physician at Phoenix Children's Hospital. He specializes in non-operative treatment of musculoskeletal injuries, fracture management, as well as ultrasound-guided procedures. He has a special interest in holistic approaches to sports performance, including sports nutrition, performance mindset, and training and recovery. Dr. Hall earned an undergraduate degree in exercise science at Rutgers University and received his medical degree from Vanderbilt. He went on to complete a pediatric residency and chief residency at Monroe Carell Jr. Children's Hospital at Vanderbilt, and he completed a sports medicine fellowship at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. He works extensively within the sports medicine community, providing educational lectures as well as team physician coverage for several local high schools. He is a volunteer physician at St. Vincent de Paul Free Clinic and an adjunct professor of physical therapy at Franklin Pierce University. Most recently, he created Next Level Sports Medicine, a sports performance consultative service, hard word, that helps athletes find a competitive edge through an organized, comprehensive approach. Please welcome Dr. Randon Hall.
All right, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm just going to jump right in to get started and get to the topics. As mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about sleep, nutrition, and recovery. Just kind of a comprehensive approach, try to be very practical and apply some real world applications. I like to move around, so I'll try to get going, but during the pandemic I had a lot of time, and anybody who has kids knows that you needed to get out of the house a little bit and find something to do. So this was my thing to get better at my current job and try to find something a little bit outside of what I do on a day-to-day as a physician. So I was able to create this program, Next Level Sports Medicine, which I call sports performance medicine. And really it's a mix of primary care, sleep, nutrition, mental health, and functional movement, injury prevention, and kind of combine those things together to create a comprehensive plan for athletes. So after a year of kind of planning and deciding, last year in 2022, I got things started and have been helping athletes since then. So my general philosophy is, in today's game, when seconds and inches matter, optimal sleep, nutrition, and recovery is essential to maximizing performance. And I think the question we have to ask is, how do we train young athletes to maximize athletic performance? So I make the case that like our current process is kind of outdated. So saying like, hey, we're gonna pick this sport, football, basketball, and we're gonna train the athlete for that sport. We're gonna say, hey, let's get strength and conditioning specific to that sport. Let's get skills training specific to that sport and formal practice, especially young athletes. And I think that misses a lot of what actually impacts performance. And so I ask you to think about, like, do I have an athlete that this sounds like who truly could have been better than what they should have or what they ended up being because they didn't address a lot of the issues that are outside that classical approach, right? So do you have athletes says, oh, I watch YouTube until I fall asleep at 11 p.m. They just don't eat enough calories throughout the day. They're frequently injured or not even able to participate. They have a poor ability to control their emotions when things aren't going well. I mean, do we teach athletes how to respond in those scenarios? Or do we just yell at the sideline, stop? Arguing with significant others before a competition, or just anxious, nervous, kids have no plan in these scenarios. And I think that shows a lot with athletes who aren't prepared to compete. So what I call is the core performance model is basically we start with the athlete first, and then we address all of the issues that make someone an elite athlete. Then we allow them to apply that to their sport, right? So we take the athlete and say, have we optimized nutrition? Have we optimized sleep? How's their mindset? How's their mental health? What's their overall health look like? Do we have injury prevention programs going? Have we looked at their function? What's their strength program? And then what I want to talk about today is, do they know how to recover? So I think the key here is that we have to evaluate, assess, and train all the factors that determine performance, not just training and competition. And I think at the high school level, definitively, we don't do that. So getting into recovery, I think the most important thing I can give you today is recovery is not the absence of activity. It is not just, I'm not doing anything, I'm recovering. It is an active process. And I want to go through some of the things that I think can be used to help determine what needs to be done in that active process. So we can't get to recovery without talking about load. Load is the amount of physical activity and mental work an athlete performs during conditioning, training, and competition. So if you have an athlete who plays basketball, maybe their minutes per game is that physical load, and then maybe their coach or their parent or they don't get along with the teammates, that's a mental load, or just the stress of preparing for the game is a mental load. And then you can see the other examples here, it just varies by sport. The fundamental purpose of training is adaptation, right? So we have this portion of time where the athlete is able to do an activity, train, they get a slightly reduced capacity as expected during that load, and then the body is meant to adapt. The neuromuscular system is meant to adapt in order to get better at the thing that they're trying to do. But what we see is if they don't have the proper recovery time or strategy, then they're going to get a decrement in skill because the continued loads lead to decrease in activity, decrease in abilities, where we want them to have an increased capacity over time, and that can only happen with proper recovery. Okay, so that gets us to the concept of functional overreaching. And that's what that little red portion in the previous slide was about. So functional overreaching is a short-term decrease in performance, right? So soreness, achiness, a little bit slower during training, but it's required for performance enhancement. if we don't have that adequate recovery, then functional overreaching becomes non-functional overreaching, or becomes overtraining, which is actually not advantageous to the athlete. But if we have a well-managed load, fatigue, and recovery cycle, then we're able to optimize performance for athletes. So getting to that point is we can't manage what we don't measure. So if we have all of these athletes out here and we don't know how to measure their load, and we don't know how to measure the fatigue that comes from that load, then how do we tell them to recover properly? So load can be measured by a variety of factors, both internal and external to athletes. Now I want to focus on ways to measure load that are practical for athletes, a high school athlete that doesn't have access to a blood chemistry lab, but ways in which we can look at load internally is rate of perceived exertion, just what their max heart rate was, and then if they did have access to a physiology lab, blood lactate levels, and then externally there's a lot out there on GPS tracking, so distance travel. I know that's going on at the college level. Just a general activity diary or activity log is useful, and then some of the force plate data, neuromuscular tech that's out there can also measure external loads. So heart rate is a good measure because it just looks at oxygen consumption, but that can be difficult to do if you don't have your whole team with a heart rate monitor. But what I do like is rate of perceived exertion. So we know what that is, but that's a subjective measure of how hard your body is working, and they've been able to show that that has an ability to be very similar to your actual heart rate during physical activity. And then just a training diary, like tracking what you're doing, keeping a close log on how intense it was and the duration of activity. So here's where I live and what I think is a useful way to apply this to your high school athletes. This can be simply done individually. You can make a spreadsheet for your team, but this concept of session rate of perceived exertion. So basically you take the duration of the activity and you multiply that by the RPE for that activity. And that gives you this arbitrary number. It's a unit of work, but because we're going to be looking at it in a ratio, it doesn't really matter what the units are here. So I just call it unit of work. Minutes times RPE gives you that unit of work. And then when we look at what's going to happen for acute on chronic work ratio, we're going to compare those two units to give ourselves an ability to be able to help the athlete. So now we know how to measure load. Let's look at fatigue. So fatigue is that decrease in physiologic and psychologic functioning of an athlete that results in an increase in physical and mental load. Why it's important is because it can lead to injury risk. It can lead to illness that is unrelated to sports activity, concussion, burnout. It also can cause decrement of skill on the field. So the reaction time, their power output, technical skill, even decision making that has nothing to do with their actual physical ability, but they're having more turnovers or whatever it may be. Those can all be affected by fatigue. So how do we measure fatigue? I think one of the realistic ways is just asking the patients through surveys or questionnaires. If you could make a short questionnaire for your athletes that they could check it, you could check it with them weekly is a great idea. Heart rate recovery, so how fast your heart rate gets back to baseline after exercise or within 2 minutes, or heart rate variability where you have differences in beat-to-beat variability is another way. And then externally, the performance metrics. So maybe just having them do a sprint to see what their sprint times are. That could be a swimming sprint, a running sprint, just to kind of get them dialed in before the session to say, where are you at this week? And then carbon dioxide tolerance test is a little bit logistically difficult because you have to blow all the air out and then hold your breath and see how long you can hold your breath. And that's another way that you can measure fatigue. So we talked about heart rate recovery, the athlete self-reported monitoring. There's tons of scales out there, but I think, I'm more for scales that are short, easy to do, and realistic, not repetitive. And I think there's a lot of scales out there that are like 62 questions. Well, that's not really realistic for a high school setting. And then performance metrics, vertical jump, sprint testing, grip strength. So in my mind, I think, okay, before basketball practice starts, we're gonna have everybody do their vertical jump test. Then that gets reported to the athletic trainer, the coach, whoever, and they're like, oh, okay, he's a little low or she's a little lower. Then you go into that self-reported monitoring. Hey, I'll use my sister's name. Hey, bring in Shelby because I want to talk to her. Her vertical jump's a little low. Let's run her through the self-reported monitoring, ask her some questions to see where she's at on that fatigue scale. That's where I think you can implement these things. Maybe sprint testing on the football field, maybe grip strength from a volleyball standpoint. Whatever it may be, you can kind of find what works best for you. So as far as the athlete self-reported monitoring, recovery stress questionnaire, the DALDA, I like this lower one here, this multi-component training distress scale. You know, there's a lot of talk about validity. I think whether that is true or not, it just gives you a baseline of questions to ask the patient. So I wanted to give you a couple examples. So in the past week, have you felt fatigued or exhausted during your training? Have you had a lack of motivation or enthusiasm? Have you felt like the training isn't improving your performance or achieving your goals? And I realize like this may not be the right thing for every athlete. Some athletes just aren't mature enough to answer these questions, but the point is you've asked them, right? And then they get used to this, the purpose of that. Why are we going through this? Because we need to determine, are you fatigued? And if you are, then we need to look at your load. So are there practical ways to manage fatigue and load in order to optimize recovery? So here's another area that I think is easy to implement. It's up to date and useful for high school athletes. So what you want to do is look at that acute chronic workload. So what I would love to see is we have a tracking of that session RPE that I talked about, just daily, tracking that daily, and then you get an average of 28 days. That's your fitness portion, right? And then you use that fatigue portion, that any 7 days, and compare it to the 28-day average. And you just look at the ratio. So the research shows that that ratios lower than 0.8, but higher than 0.5 have an increased risk of injury. Or just an overall jump in that 7-day average also has an increase of injury when that jump is more than 15%. So the idea is, right, you don't want to do nothing, you don't want to do too much, and you don't want to increase quickly. And that's a way to measure that for the young athletes. But you also can do it easily without all that math, just like pick something. So you might say like, hey, we can measure strokes per session of swim. We can measure throws per practice, miles per week. You have a student assistant at the school. When you're going through video, they can be counting how many times did the running back take a big hit. Now we have ability to compare week to week and say, wow, our numbers are up. We may want to decrease our load during this week in practice. And then as talked about the self-reported monitoring, what I like to do is use that as a adjunct to the acute on chronic workload to be able to find if there's any other factors that are playing a role here. Then the physical performance aspects. So weekly monitoring, like I mentioned, vertical jump, 40-yard dash, shuttle run, grip strength. So you go to the coach and say, hey, why don't we have them do a 40-yard dash every week before practice, or pick a time on a day when there's not a lot going on, and then we're going to track that over time, right? We get a baseline, we track it over time, and if we start to see people drop, then we want to add in that survey to see if there's anything going on in their life or whatever. Then we want to look to see, okay, do we need to change their load this week? Do we need to sit them this week? Those are things that I think right now are not being done. It's just practice and play as much as possible. And then if possible, if you have a heart rate monitor, I know they're not as accurate as we want them to be, the wrist ones, but you can look at heart rate recovery, you can look at heart rate variability as a measure of fatigue. So post-workout, I think this is the most important point I want to leave you with on the recovery side is activity is sympathetic. Recovery is parasympathetic. You have to turn on parasympathetic. Just like when you're out here doing your thing, you tell them, hey, I want you to turn on that glute. We want to turn on recovery. It's not just like I stopped and then I went home and watched some TV. So what I recommend is down regulation. So you want to down regulate. So I was thinking of an example that I could give is like you want to take that intense booming music and you want to go Jack Johnson with it. Even though every song sounds exactly the same, you want to just turn that down. You want to go down regulate breathing. So I like triangle breathing, but box breathing is another technique. So you go inhale, slowly, hold, exhale. I'd like a 6-3-8, so I go triangle. So I do my workout, I get to the car, and I do my triangle breathing. Inhale 6, hold for 3, exhale. I don't like the other hold at the end of the exhale, but that's a down regulation. Cold water immersion. So I think this brings up an important point of what are we recovering for? What part of the season are we in, right? So if we are in a basketball tournament and we know we have a game tomorrow or in another day, right? Cold water immersion might be nice to decrease muscle soreness. But if we are off season and we're doing a lifting program, we don't want to go heavy on cold water immersion because that's going to reduce that adaptations that we talked about before. We want to create an inflammatory response in the muscles. Same concept with NSAIDs, right? If an injury is limiting the athlete in season, okay, we maybe want to treat with that. But it's going to have a negative impact on strength gains if we're outside the season, so we may want to use a different strategy. And then there is good data on compression gear, massage, pneumatic compression can potentially aid in reducing muscle soreness by reducing muscle edema. So I think this just kind of gets at the concept of, I think it's a little bit, I don't want to say outdated, but it's a little bit nuanced to say like, hey, when we do weight training, we're getting these micro tears in the muscle. I don't think that's quite accurate. I think what's happening is we're causing an inflammatory response and the body is responding with neuroadaptation. And with that inflammatory response, you're getting edema that's going to cause some soreness. So low level movement and stretching is another way to reduce that. There is some good data on, this is not recovery necessarily, but like if you have a flight or if you have a bus ride, wearing compression gear during that time can be helpful and improve performance. So now that we know a little bit on the recovery side, let's talk about the nutrition recovery as well. So I could do a whole hour on this one, but just to kind of hit the high points. So this is I kind of say this is our approach at Next Level. We want every athlete to have the right type of food, the right amount at the right time. I'm telling you, I've worked with athletes that this is terrible. So we want to say, what is your pregame routine? We go deep dive there. What's your energy balance look like? What's your supplement strategy? Do you have a plan when it's a regular game or a tournament? What do you do differently? And then today I want to talk about post-game recovery or post-workout recovery. So particularly on days with multiple sessions, this is key. I think, if you have a Friday night football game, you may not really be in this intense hurry to get this super optimized recovery on the nutrition side because you don't have another game until the next Friday. But with a basketball or volleyball, this is really important if you have multiple sessions or during summer where you have multiple practice workouts. You want your post-exercise snack to be generally carbohydrate and protein, and that's kind of where this chocolate milk gained popularity, which I'll talk about in a second. And then that post-game meal should be within 2 to 3 hours after the exercise session, but the sooner the better. So the question is why? Well, the why is rapid phase of glycogen synthesis is maximized within the first hour after exercise. So that's when the body is best at reestablishing the carbohydrate stores where it's stored as glycogen in the muscle. Even within 2 hours of exercise, stopping exercise, there's increased efficiency. The increased efficiencies of muscle metabolism are reduced by about 50%. So the general recommendation is 1 gram per kilo per hour of carb with a 3-to-1 ratio of carb to protein, so getting a little bit more synergistic with the insulin response. So it just so happens that kids like chocolate milk, we can keep it cold, and oh, by the way, if you take a 65 kilo kid, they can get 65 grams of carb and it has about 20 grams of protein, so that gives you a 3-to-1 ratio. So there's nothing special about the milk. It just happens to meet all the criteria that we would want in recovery. So it doesn't matter, it's just the chocolate part is like, they just like that better. Now protein. So both casein and whey protein contain all the essential amino acids needed by the body. Soy is actually not a bad protein source as well for those who are plant-based, but their amino acid profiles differ slightly. So there's a lot more branched chain amino acids in the whey protein compared to casein. So the thought is that whey is rapidly digested and has these high levels of branched chain amino acids, so that's a better pre or post-workout protein source. Where casein is kind of congeals together in the gut and it's more slowly and evenly digested, so that's a better option for a fasted period like sleeping, and you can still get that slow release of protein to help with muscle protein synthesis. So that's kind of what I'll tell people if they ask about protein and post-workout. And then the last aspect is leucine. So leucine's an essential amino acid. It is in whey protein, but the point of it is that it's thought to trigger protein synthesis. So it kind of activates it. So branched chain amino acid, it is a branched chain amino acid, and it happens to be able to be metabolized in the muscle. So the thought is that after exercise, you have these branched chain amino acids floating around, and then the muscle can use those for energy instead of breaking itself down. And then additionally, that leucine can help with initiation of muscle protein synthesis. So there's data that using leucine or rich protein can be helpful. There are some plant sources as well, like chickpeas, edamame are good sources of leucine. So now jumping to sleep. And I will be very honest, this is a very common sense portion of the talk. There is nothing special about what I'm going to tell you other than nobody does it. Do athletes have sleep issues? Definitely. So generally 8 to 10 hours are required for adolescents, a little more than what adults need for optimal performance and health. The American College of Health Association did a survey and found that most student athletes report 4 nights of insufficient sleep per week. And then the NCAA looked at it and said 1/3 of student athletes get fewer than 7 hours of sleep per night. So why does that matter? Well, it matters because inadequate sleep definitively affects performance. Premature exhaustion. I'm telling you, I want you to go do your run on the treadmill and then stay up all night and try to do it again. You will be feeling it. Premature exhaustion, lack of mental focus, their recovery just isn't as good as it should be. Increased injury and concussion rates, and then worsened performance anxiety can all be factors in inadequate sleep. So does improved sleep affect performance? That's the question. So Sherry Ma's a doc from Stanford that kind of did some of the initial studies on this, and she looked at Stanford athletes and she said, okay, we're going to take their baseline sleep, which was about 6 hours a night. So this is basketball. We're going to do an intervention and increase the amount of time that they slept, and they checked that through different bands and sleep monitors, and they just looked at performance. It wasn't a game, but they just did a performance session. So they did a time sprint, 0.7 seconds faster. They did 10 free throws, 9% increase free throw percentage, and then a 3-point percentage increase with 15 shots by 9%, right? Games are won and lost all the time by 1 point. And if it makes a difference how they sleep, that's huge. Same study was done in tennis. So they increased their baseline from 7.1 to 8.85 hours of sleep and saw serving accuracy increase 6%. Some of this data was also repeated at UCLA with a similar result. So here's our approach. What we start out with is a sleep screen. We just ask them everything and anything about how they go to sleep, how they prepare to sleep, what's their sleep routine, what's their sleep hygiene, right? And we gotta remember, right, not everybody has all the resources, right? Sometimes it's like, hey, we got 2 people, 3 people in a room, and that may be a challenge. What's their weekend routine, right? Are they sleeping until noon when they're used to getting up at 7? Their training times, their caffeine intake. Do they have a napping strategy? Do they have a travel routine? So when they're out of town, what's the plan? Hey, when we're traveling, if this is that big of a deal, we want to get a high hotel room floor. We want to be away from the elevator. We want to make sure we have blackout lights. Those are all strategies that I'm going through them with, like, oh, I never thought of that. Why are we going to be right next to the ice maker? Like, all of those things impact performance. So the common mistakes that I see is athletes simply do not get enough hours of sleep. You know, I live out in Goodyear. I have athletes driving all the way to Brophy. I have athletes driving all the way to Scottsdale, right? So they practice into the night, they get home an hour later, then they have to be back up to be at the school in the morning, right? That's just not feasible for performance. No consistent sleep routine. So I really tell athletes, like, you know, don't focus so much on the hours, just focus on the routine, the process, and the hours will come. Too much exposure to blue light late in the evening, poor sleep hygiene, and then inconsistent weekend routine. So in summary, what I would say is you've got to consider practical ways that you can measure load, measure fatigue, and then think about implementing some common sense recovery techniques. You want to implement a basic goal-oriented nutritional strategy that can improve performance or physiologic response based on where they are at in their training cycle. Are they off-season, pre-season, post-season, or in-season? And then lastly, very simple, easy to do, screen athletes for poor sleep behaviors, provide practical advice on sleep hygiene to improve performance. And then this is my information. That's my work number. For those who are here, I'm happy to give you my direct cell number as well. But if you need anything or have any questions, I'm available. Yeah, hit it.